Now, it's recently come to my attention that I've once again become a jaded boomer asshole about video games. And this is no surprise to me, it's happened several times before, as I've lived through the death of all of my favorite games of all time. And so I figured if the future looks bleak, it might be time to look towards the past and remind myself why I fell in love with gaming in the first place. And along the way, I'll attempt to answer the question, does the 360 hold up? Well, time to grab ourselves our next game, but if you watched the last entry in this series, then you'll know that we'll be doing the Borderlands pre-sequel this week. The last entry in this Borderlands marathon I've been doing in the lead up to the Borderlands 4 release. And you know, I would love to do a kazoo cover of this game's intro, but unfortunately, I just don't care about the intro to this game. It's just so lacking in punch compared to the other two. I can't really say that I enjoyed the music all that much and had much drive to want to recreate it. And so that's disappointing, but so is this game. Right? See, I never really even considered picking up or playing this game. After playing Borderlands 2, I was a huge fan of the series, I would say, and I was incredibly hyped for a potential third entry in the series. But after years of waiting, when they finally announced the pre-sequel, I can't say I was anything but disappointed in the concept. Yes, it is interesting to see a story from Handsome Jack's perspective, explaining something that might have happened in his past to describe why he is the way he is in the Borderlands sequel. But to me, that just wasn't enough to make it justifiable as a Borderlands game. And it was pretty clear that the Borderlands pre-sequel was not going to be a full Borderlands game. It was something else, something in the middle. And I really could have overlooked a lot of that and just enjoyed the game as a lesser Borderlands game. That was a smaller, more self-contained, isolated thing, essentially just being a big DLC to Borderlands 2, if it wasn't for the fact that I just cannot find any of these characters they introduced all that interesting. That was the big killer of my interest in this game. Borderlands 1 and 2 has a pretty solid lineup of characters, each of which represents a style of play and a class that should cover the grounds of pretty much any character that someone would want to play within a looter shooter. There's always the Siren character, a roguish character, a more tanky berserker character, and a soldier, with more straightforward gunplay based gameplay. Unfortunately for the pre-sequel, the bigger meta of this game is that it's exploring the backstory of characters that we mostly already know. And I think that the characters they picked are fucking awful. Well, let's just go through them real quick. First of all, we have Wilhelm, a techromancer cyborg style character who would be pretty interesting and fun to play as if it weren't for the fact that this character fucking sucks ass in Borderlands 2. He's basically just reduced to a goon of Handsome Jack, who Handsome Jack is willing to sacrifice just so that we can get our hands on the trapped power core that allows him to attack Sanctuary. I really didn't like the idea of playing as a character that gets absolutely shit on in the sequel. Next we have Nisha, a gun-toting sheriff character that also appeared in Borderlands 2 as Handsome Jack's girlfriend. Again, this character seems pretty cool on paper, except when you understand the lore that we know about her in Borderlands 2. Namely that she killed Brick's dog. Listen, I don't mind playing an evil character. It's just that this character reaches that level of cartoonish evil that's gonna leave a bad taste in your mouth. In Borderlands 2, she represents a handful of side quests in a cowboy town area and isn't all that important, and so it's not a big deal if she's just a dog-killing sociopath. But I can't say I really want to play as a character like that. Next we have Claptrap, the gimmick character who has an assortment of alts or action skills, which is completely unreliable, and we all kind of understand that Claptrap is just the meme character. He's just a joke, highlighted by his intro title card saying that he's a mistake. And honestly, they kind of hit that nail on the head there. I don't think it was a good idea to make Claptrap a playable character just for silliness. And I was half tempted to pick this character just to really lean into that silly nature and see how far it goes. But I didn't want to taint my experience of this game like that and skew my total opinion of whether or not the game holds up. And so ultimately I decided to go with the character that seemed like the only legitimate option. Athena, a character I originally wasn't interested in playing as because I just wasn't a fan of Marvel, and it seems pretty clear that she's just kind of a Captain America ripoff because that shit was popular at the time of this game's release, I imagine. But Athena really feels like she's the only legitimate option. For one, the entire story is framed around Athena and the trial that she's undergoing at the hands of Lilith and the other original Vault Hunters. She is the narrator, and I don't know if that kind of changes if you pick a different character, but it just generally seems like she's supposed to be the main character of this game. It certainly makes the most sense story-wise that she's a mercenary that Handsome Jack would hire to help him complete his goals throughout the campaign. The other two just seem like filler and references to Borderlands 2, and Claptrap is obviously just a joke. And so with this lineup of characters, I never purchased the pre-sequel. I never felt like playing it because there was just no one I wanted to play as. That being said, in hindsight, I do really like playing as Athena. Her action skill comes back quick and is really powerful, and really helped me get through some of the levels at the end of the game that I was very underleveled for. Because I really didn't feel like doing many side quests in this game. I just wasn't that invested in the story that's taking place on Pandora's moon, for a variety of reasons I'll get into later. And so I was somewhere around under 4 levels of where I should have been for the majority of the story. Fortunately for me, Athena's action skill came in so clutch at so many moments, allowing me to soak up a ton of damage that would have otherwise hard stopped me and forced me to go grind levels. I can't imagine how terrible this playthrough would have felt had I picked Claptrap, so certainly glad I picked Athena. Now getting into the actual game, the question that really is on my mind as to whether or not this game holds up or not comes down to what really is this game and what is it trying to be? There's certainly an argument to be said that this could have just been a DLC for Borderlands 2. And I feel like this conversation has been a thematic reoccurrence lately in my discussion about video games. It seems like a lot of these titles either sink or swim based on whether or not the developers can decide what they're actually making. Either a DLC or a standalone product, and whether or not that content itself is standalone, regardless of whether it counts as a DLC in-game or its own release. One of the best examples I have for a game that could have been a DLC but works perfectly well as a standalone release is Far Cry Blood Dragon, a game that's obviously about half the size of Far Cry 3 and is a reskin of a majority of the features, functions, and weapons, but obviously had to be a standalone experience and therefore worked best just to sell individually at a smaller price point, allowing people to purchase the game without ever having touched Far Cry 3. For convenience's sake, this is a thoughtful way to release this content. On the other side of the spectrum, we have both the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC and the Lies of P Overture DLC, both of which suffer immense replayability issues, both of which were so large they could have been released as a standalone experience if that experience was fine-tuned to be a separate campaign with its own progression system and such. And while I have tons of individual issues with both these pieces of content, I think a large amount of issues could have been solved if the developers had a greater vision of what they were trying to accomplish with the content. A lot of developer effort didn't have to be wasted on single playthroughs of giant swaths of content. Another example of content that separates itself from its main game experience but works well as a DLC are the expansions to Dishonored, which both feature stories that are independent of the main game and explore Dowd's side of the story. Having a separate experience in-game enhances the base game story without interfering with it. And so how does that question of how should content be released apply to Borderlands the pre-sequel, a game that very clearly could have been a DLC if it wanted to? Well, there's no short answer to that, because Borderlands the pre-sequel couldn't have really been a DLC, or maybe shouldn't have been. Mainly because the story that's taking place in the pre-sequel is just far too important to relegate to a side adventure locked away behind a game itself and then another paywall. That is the strongest part of the Borderlands pre-sequel, the backstory that you get about the most important villain in Borderlands. And so it certainly had to be something more than just an add-on to Borderlands 2. But unfortunately that story doesn't seem to have enough weight to it to carry an entire game. it's very clear that this game is basically just a port of Borderlands 2 with some minor tweaks to it to make it appear as though it's a full release. And I don't think those minor tweaks make up for that decision. The changes include the oxygen system, which adds another item to your kit and inventory, allowing you to upgrade how long you can breathe in space, and also perform ass slams and double jumps. And this was something that also made me not want to purchase the game. I just felt like it was going to be stressful to manage your oxygen within the combat scenarios of the game, but unfortunately it goes in the opposite direction and ends up being so unobtrusive to the gameplay that the system is basically meaningless. I think I ran out of oxygen all of one time throughout my entire playthrough, and that's largely due to the fact that the last half of the game you just spend back on the Hyperion space station, where there's full oxygen for the most part. The ass slam attack is interesting, I guess. It's kind of fun to splatter a bunch of enemies with a powered up O2 kit, but it definitely seems like a half-assed mechanic that was only there to really allow you the control to do platforming better in the low G environments. Overall, kind of a non-change that doesn't really do much to the overall Borderlands experience. Along the same line of thought as platforming, they've also added these jump pads, which just feel very cartoony and kind of out of place. Like, it's clear they're trying to get the most out of the low G sections of this game, but they just don't do anything. They're just a means of travel, and the game has the balls to like hype them up through Brick's dialogue saying how awesome they are, which is really cringe, but whatever. The last few changes are the additions of the laser guns, which I do think are cool and were the majority of the weapons that I ended up using in my entire playthrough, specifically because Moxie gives you a really good electric one that synergized really well with Athena's abilities. And also this game introduces cryo damage, which, let's be honest, is just a fill-in for the lack of slag. So overall, the changes from the Borderlands 2 gameplay are really just not that expansive. This is very clearly just Borderlands 2 with extra steps and less content. You see, this game is so ridiculously bloated when it comes to making you do busy work in between missions. If you boil down the main campaign, it's essentially flee the Hyperion space station, landing on the Pandora moon. The moon is about to be hit by a laser beam that's going to destroy it, and so we need to build a robot army to assault the Hyperion space station, then assault the Hyperion space station, killing the meaningless bad guy who had zero impact on the entire game, other than just being someone who's firing the laser, and then go after the vault after Jack loses the laser and becomes power hungry. It's a really simple framework for a story, but the way they go about filling out the main campaign is just by having these absurdly long missions with so many unnecessary points thrown in, such as the mission where we're tasked with obtaining a military-grade AI, which takes like 40 minutes to complete, and then the subsequent mission where we're tasked with building the constructor bots from Borderlands 2 and then placing that AI inside them. The point of this mission is obviously to show the progression of the AI not wanting to be part of this machine, offering up the alternative that she could copy herself into it, but it would take a couple days, with ultimately Handsome Jack realizing they don't have a couple days, and so he forces her to do it. But the process of that dialogue taking place requires you to do so many unnecessary steps, such as obtaining legs and turrets for the constructor, which you ultimately end up shooting off of it in a boss fight. This mission could be half as long and accomplish just as much as it does. That's just the thing, this is such a bloated experience that I think you could basically cut out the entirety of the moon sequence and just have it be a couple mission long DLC where Jack doesn't flee from Hyperion Station and instead just stands his ground there and eventually goes through with the more important story elements. And that's kind of crazy. I feel like this game was advertised as though we would be exploring Pandora's moon. But I would say the moon parts of this game suck much worse than the Hyperion Station gameplay. And part of that at least comes down to just how offensively Australian a lot of the characters are on the moon. Like, don't get me wrong, I like Australian people, but at a certain point it just gets ridiculous. Almost the entirety of the writing of dialogue within the moon sections of the gameplay derive their humor from absurd caricatures of Australians' ways of speaking. There's not a ton of jokes, but they certainly wanted to meet that same Borderlands 2 humor-driven atmosphere, and so they just fill the entire moon with obnoxious Australian dudes, which can be pretty grating. Now, one of the smaller subtleties that definitely reveals how bloated and underdeveloped this game is are the title cards for different enemies and characters, of which they give to some of the most meaningless, forgettable characters you've ever seen in your life, such as the Mariff, the mayor sheriff, who essentially only gets talked about for like 3 missions, and by the time he's on screen, he survives for another 20 seconds before Handsome Jack puts a bullet in his head. There's also Pickle, a character I forgot about until making this video, which is strange because I beat the game a day ago. He shows up for a couple of missions to help you do some engineering related tasks. Again, just bloated busy work for the sake of inflating missions and making this feel like it's a full game. And to me, the worst title card offender comes down to a random enemy that you see at basically the end of the game, one of the last things you'll fight before reaching the final boss fight, which is just a higher elite tier of Iridian Guardian who can give birth to other Iridian enemies. There's a fucking title card and an achievement for killing this enemy, but it's not a boss, it's not anything. It's just a random higher tiered enemy version of a bunch of enemies we've been fighting this whole level. And it's especially strange that there's more of this enemy in this level. There's like a bunch of them at the top tier of this area. It just almost feels like this game knew that it needed to have silly title cards and fill out that Borderlands experience, but it just didn't have the gas. It didn't have the content. So let's just slap one on some random enemy. Okay, all of that comes together to make kind of an irking experience. It is somewhat forgivable because the game is not meant to be an exploratory, full game experience. The real draw of this game is obviously to flesh out Handsome Jack's storyline. And so a lot of whether or not this game holds up comes down to if this storyline holds up. So let's go through a bit of that. To start, the framing of the narrative is based on Athena retelling the events of the story. I like this as a framework to tell the story. It's kind of interesting to have the present day characters interject at times in fourth wall break kind of moments. The earliest of which are used to point out how different the main characters from the original game's opinions of Handsome Jack were to Athena's. In the early moments of this game, Handsome Jack is depicted as very nice and considerate. He has a weird amount of humility to him that you wouldn't expect. But there are small cracks that show in this facade. For instance, he doesn't care when claptraps die, which as far as we can tell are sentient robots, so there are small hints to tell us that something's wrong here. This progresses further when he forces Felicity, the military AI, into his constructor robot, which again feels like it is this cold-hearted, monstrous moment, but the reality is the entire moon is going to be destroyed if we don't get our robot army. And so it is an unfortunate but practical decision to make to reduce the time it would take for us to assault Hyperion's station. And Jack constantly points out that this is to save however many lives are on that moon. It's a perfectly reasonable but unfortunate decision to make. And ultimately the breaking point that shatters Jack's facade of being a reasonable, nice guy is the moment that he ejects an entire team of scientists out into space because one of them betrayed him. And this is the final moment where it's revealed to us that Jack really is a sociopath. An incredibly high-functioning sociopath, but a dangerous sociopath. So long as you're helping him achieve his goals, he can be completely kind and thoughtful towards you. Jack starts out with having many layers to his character, layers that hide how much of a self-centered character he really is, because the majority of the characters around him are trying to help him, and so it's perfectly aligned with him to show appreciation and thoughtfulness towards them. But as we progress through the story, those layers are broken down time and time again, until ultimately he's laid completely bare in the state that we see him in Borderlands 2. The ironic thing is that he really could have been kind of a good guy if things had played out slightly different. Like, you know how most CEOs are sociopaths? Within a different timeline, where Handsome Jack got what he wanted without much struggle, he could have been seen as a somewhat altruistic CEO of Hyperion. But the reason he's such a compelling character is that you get to see both sides of this personality come into play, which is highlighted when the Vault Hunters from the original game betray Handsome Jack and end up destroying his laser, which was made of the Destroyer's Eye, the final boss from the first game. I really like this aspect of the game because it gives a lot of value and weight to the otherwise unimportant final boss of that game, especially now that we know through the events of Borderlands 2 that Handsome Jack was the one guiding the Vault Hunters to the vault. Using the Eye of the Destroyer as a weapon is a really nice added detail to show just how power-hungry Jack really is. And ultimately, when he's betrayed and that eye is destroyed, you see how he reacts when someone starts stripping away that power from him and working against him. Suddenly all of his enemies are just bandits he needs to burn. And now that we've fully seen that he is a sociopath, the moment when he obtains the treasure from the vault, which is in reality just a prophecy to have him awaken the warrior, it becomes clear to Athena that Handsome Jack really is a force for no good at this point. She fell for his facade, and after it started to crumble, there was nothing left for her to follow. I really like the majority of the story content throughout the pre-sequel. I think they did a lot of work to flesh out a understandable and realistic sociopathic character. And we see the full spectrum of him hiding his tendencies from the world and drawing people in, and then slowly losing his control over his more violent tendencies and want for power. And to me, it makes total sense why the mercenary Athena would follow him and continue following him up until that very moment where he loses all control. It seems perfectly reasonable. And that's why the absolute worst aspect of this game, to me, is the fact that she's on trial at all. The framing of this game kind of falls apart once you realize the true events of the game, which is made especially poignant when Lilith orders the execution of Athena at the end. Mainly because, Lilith, you were fucking there for like half of the game. Like, sure, you were the one who betrayed Handsome Jack, so you weren't working with him, but that's arguably more damning than anything. Lilith is the reason that Handsome Jack is the way he is in Borderlands 2. Like, you can say what you will about him having access to a death laser. It's probably not going to be a good thing for a lot of people. But betraying him and trying to kill him and failing to kill him was ultimately his greatest moment of downfall. That's where he became the monster that we see in Borderlands 2. And all of this would be reasonably fine if it weren't for the fact that she shows up at the end and punches the vault symbol into his face, destroying one of his eyes, disfiguring him, and then leaving him alive? Like, am I missing something? Is this just a hallucination? Is this just part of the prophecy? Is Lilith really here? Did she do this? And then she walks away and phases out, leaving this monster alive. So that what, he can do the events that take place in Borderlands 2? Like, functionally, Lilith got Roland killed here. She should absolutely not be the leader in charge of this trial. Like, sure, she has siren powers, but she is so irresponsible. Even in Borderlands 2, when she was explicitly told not to enter the control center where Angel was, and then look what happens, she gets captured by Handsome Jack. Yeah, Lilith is hands down the worst part of the story, and I maybe feel like I'm just missing something, because this whole sequence just feels stupid after you've seen the events of the game. Like, thank God the Iridian shows up and stops the bullets and saves Athena, because Athena is hands down a better character than Lilith. I don't know. It's a small point, and it does seem like they were kind of pinned up against a wall trying to fill in the blanks of what had happened in between the different games. But overall, I think the story is pretty good. And despite all of the strange choices made to the Borderlands experience in this game, and despite the fact that it's not a full game, let's be honest, it's bloated as hell. There was no reason they should have sold this at full price. Despite all that, I do think it's worth playing through at least once to get the experience of the storyline. Just make sure to play as Athena, so that way you can actually beat the storyline without having to do a bunch of arbitrary busywork side quests. I really would not have beaten the final boss if it wasn't for Athena. Her action skill is just awesome. And even then, I ended up landing in a puddle of acid while hitting the final blow on the boss, so we traded. But I think overall my takeaway from this game is, I'm glad I didn't play it when it came out. I didn't want to have to pay $60 for this. But I'm much more glad that I played it now. I think it was like $7 on eBay. And so the question of does it hold up really comes down to, yeah, it holds up better than it did before because it costs less. I paid an appropriate amount of money for the experience. Unfortunately, I just had to do that about, 10 years too late? But in the lead up to Borderlands 4, it was a cool experience to play through all 3 of these games in a row. It is a pretty wide spectrum of quality across them all, but the experience is cool. The world of Borderlands is fun and silly, and it was nice to revisit. However, at this point, I think I'm Borderlands out. I don't think I'll be buying Borderlands 4. I've just done too much looting, too much shooting, and really all I want to play right now is fucking Helldivers. Helldivers is so good. Anyway, that'll be it for this episode. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any recommendations for other 360 games I might play in this series. Let me know if you're enjoying this series or if I should just stop because it gets no views. Don't worry, I should be making more Souls content soon, I hope. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.
John, is that you?
Call me Jack, honey. Handsome Jack.